Half of Georgetown's free population gathered to witness the scandal. The cell was examined thoroughly. The lock showed no signs of tampering because it had been opened with a key. The iron door hung properly on its hinges. The window, a narrow slit barely wide enough for a child to squeeze through, remained barred and secure. There was no tunnel, no loosened stones, no hidden passage. She simply vanished. Someone whispered, and the word spread through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Vanished, like smoke, like a demon summoned back to hell. A search party was organized immediately. McLeish, who prided himself on tracking skills learned from Indian traders, led a dozen men into the woods north of Georgetown. They found no tracks, no broken branches, no sign of passage. It was as if Sarah had simply ceased to exist the moment she left the cell. Witchcraft, Dr. Hayes pronounced, clear evidence that our judgment was correct. Only supernatural powers could accomplish such an escape. The magistrate, examining the cell personally, found himself troubled by a different question. If she could vanish through witchcraft, why wait until the night before execution? Why not escape immediately upon arrest? Nobody had a good answer to this. The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and unanswered. Jonathan Fairmont offered a reward, £50 for Sarah's capture, dead or alive. It was an enormous sum, enough to buy several slaves or a small plot of land. Bounty hunters arrived from Charleston, men who specialized in tracking escaped slaves through swamp and forest. They searched for 2 weeks and found nothing. At the Fairmont plantation, strange things began happening. Not supernatural, nothing that couldn't be explained, but unsettling nonetheless. The rice crop, usually reliable, began failing in one section of fields. McLeish investigated and found the trunk gates sabotaged, allowing salt water to flood the paddies at the wrong time. Someone with knowledge of rice cultivation had done it deliberately. A fire started in one of the storage barns, destroying that season's seed rice. The cause was never determined, but the burn pattern suggested it began in multiple places simultaneously. Horses fell lame. Tools went missing. A section of fence collapsed, allowing several pigs to escape into the forest. Each incident could be accident or negligence. Taken together, they felt like revenge. The enslaved community at Fairmont moved through their work with careful neutrality, showing neither satisfaction nor concern. But in the quarters at night, they sang songs that hadn't been heard in years. Old songs from across the ocean, songs about tricksters and freedom, songs about those who escaped bondage through cunning rather than violence. Jonathan began drinking more heavily. Catherine withdrew into silence, spending hours in Benjamin's empty room. The plantation, once prosperous, began declining, not catastrophically but steadily, like a wound that wouldn't quite heal. Dr. Hayes published a pamphlet, an account of witchcraft in the Carolina Lowcountry being a true relation of the escape of the witch woman Sarah through diabolical arts. It sold briskly in Charleston and Savannah, establishing Hayes's reputation as an expert on supernatural matters. He never mentioned that he'd been wrong about Benjamin's treatment, or that Sarah's remedies had proven more effective than his own. In Georgetown, the jail lock was changed. Jenkins was questioned extensively but stuck to his story. He'd been working at his desk and had dozed off briefly. When he woke, the cell was empty. How? He didn't know. Must have been witchcraft, just like everyone said. The magistrate didn't believe him but couldn't prove otherwise. Jenkins kept his position, though his reputation never fully recovered. His daughter Martha's headaches, however, remained manageable for the rest of her life. 2 months after Sarah's escape, a traveling merchant passing through Georgetown mentioned that he'd heard stories from the backcountry about a woman healer who'd settled near a Cherokee trading path, treating both colonists and Indians with equal skill. She was described as tall, with observant eyes and hands that moved with peculiar precision when working with plants. The magistrate sent inquiries but received no cooperation. The backcountry operated by different rules, and a skilled healer, whatever her legal status, was too valuable to surrender for any reward. The truth about Sarah's escape remained hidden until 1779, when Hosea Jenkins lay dying of the fever that had plagued Georgetown that summer. With death approaching and conscience weighing heavy, he sent for his pastor and made a confession. "I let her go," he said, his voice weak but clear. "I opened the cell and gave her supplies and directions. She didn't vanish through witchcraft. She walked out through an unlocked door while I pretended not to notice." The pastor, Reverend Samuel Blackwell, was shocked. "You allowed a convicted witch to escape?" "I allowed a healer who saved my daughter's life to avoid execution for the crime of being better at medicine than the men who charge money for it." Jenkins coughed, the sound wet and painful. "She wasn't a witch. She was a woman who paid attention to the world around her and learned from it. We burned her because she made educated men feel inadequate and because she was enslaved and therefore couldn't be allowed to possess knowledge that exceeded her masters." But Jenkins had more to confess than just opening a door. In his fever-weakened state, 30 years of carried guilt poured out in fragments that Reverend Blackwell struggled to piece together. Sarah hadn't been entirely unprepared for her escape, Jenkins revealed. During her month of imprisonment, she'd had one regular visitor besides Jenkins himself, a free black woman named Phyllis Rutherford, who operated a small bakery in Georgetown, supplying bread to the courthouse and jail. Phyllis was one of perhaps 24 free people of color living in the district. Her freedom purchased years earlier by a grateful merchant whose life she'd saved through skilled nursing during a yellow fever outbreak. Phyllis had known Sarah before the arrest. Years earlier, Sarah had helped Phyllis's sister through a difficult childbirth at one of the neighboring plantations. The baby had been breech, and the white midwife had given up, declaring both mother and child lost. Sarah had been summoned as a last resort. Through careful manipulation and patience that lasted 8 hours, she'd turned the baby and delivered him alive. The mother survived. Phyllis never forgot. When Sarah was arrested, Phyllis began visiting the jail under the pretense of delivering fresh bread, an unnecessary luxury that she claimed was Christian charity for the condemned. She would sit outside Sarah's cell and read scripture aloud, as was considered proper. But within those scripture readings, she embedded information. Names of safe houses, descriptions of landmarks along escape routes, warnings about which roads had patrol stations. Jenkins had known about these communications but chose ignorance. His role was to keep prisoners locked up, not to monitor every word spoken through the bars. When he made the decision to unlock Sarah's cell, he knew she wouldn't be walking into complete darkness. Phyllis had already mapped the path, but there was more. In the 2 days between Sarah's escape and Jenkins's official discovery of the empty cell, a conspiracy of silence had operated across Georgetown that nobody ever fully acknowledged. The night watchman who should have been patrolling near the jail reported seeing nothing unusual. The merchant whose stable backed up to the jail property didn't hear when someone took one of his horses, a mare with a gentle temperament, gone for 3 days, and then mysteriously returned. The ferryman at the river crossing north of town somehow failed to notice a tall woman crossing just before dawn. "We weren't all heartless," Jenkins whispered. "Some of us knew the trial was wrong. We couldn't stop it." The magistrate had decided. Dr. Hayes had testified Jonathan Fairmont wanted blood. But we could choose not to see certain things. We could choose to be looking the wrong direction at the right moment. Reverend Blackwell asked the question that would haunt him. How many others were involved? Jenkins's answer was both specific and vague. Count the people in Georgetown whose lives she saved. Then count how many of them testified against her. The difference is your answer. Of the 33 people Sarah had successfully treated, only 3 had testified at her trial. 30 others had remained silent, neither defending nor condemning her. But silence, Jenkins suggested, wasn't always cowardice. Sometimes it was calculated restraint, the decision not to add your voice to either side so that later, if opportunity came, you could act without having committed yourself publicly. Jenkins died that evening before he could provide more names. Reverend Blackwell was left with a confession that implicated dozens of Georgetown citizens in a conspiracy to undermine a legal execution. He struggled with what to do about this knowledge. The Revolutionary War was in full chaos in 1779. British forces controlled much of South Carolina. Georgetown itself would change hands multiple times over the next 2 years. In the midst of this upheaval, prosecuting people for a 30-year-old mercy seemed absurd. More than absurd. It seemed like precisely the kind of rigid adherence to law over justice that the revolution itself was supposedly fighting against. Blackwell made a decision that would define his ministry. He recorded Jenkins's confession in his private journal but took no official action. He did, however, begin asking quiet questions about what had happened to the woman who'd escaped. This investigation led him to Phyllis Rutherford, now in her 60s and still operating her bakery, despite the war's disruptions. When Blackwell approached her after Sunday services and mentioned Jenkins's deathbed confession, Phyllis studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Walk with me, Reverend." They walked along the riverfront, away from listening ears. Phyllis spoke in a low voice about a network that nobody acknowledged, but everyone knew existed. A loose organization of free black people, sympathetic white citizens, and trusted enslaved individuals who helped move people to safety when the law became an instrument of injustice rather than protection. "We didn't do it often," Phyllis said. "Couldn't. Each escape made the next one harder, made the authorities more suspicious. But sometimes a case was so clearly wrong that silence became impossible. Sarah was one of those cases." Phyllis revealed details that Jenkins hadn't known. The escape route had been planned for 2 weeks before Jenkins made his decision. They'd been waiting for him, or someone like him, to provide the opening. If Jenkins hadn't unlocked the door, they'd found a blacksmith willing to forge a key. If that failed, they'd identified a weak point in the jail's brick wall that could be breached with tools and time. One way or another, Sarah would not have burned. "You have to understand," Phyllis said. "By 1748, we'd all seen what happened when knowledge met fear. Sarah's crime wasn't witchcraft. It was competence. She made educated white men look incompetent, and worse, she did it while enslaved. That combination couldn't be tolerated. If they'd burned her, what message would that send? That any enslaved person with skills exceeding their station could be executed on supernatural charges. We couldn't allow that precedent." Reverend Blackwell asked the question that mattered most. "Did she survive? Did she make it to freedom?" Phyllis smiled but didn't answer directly. "I received a letter once, years after the escape. It came through Charleston, passed hand to hand until it reached me. No signature, no return address. But I knew the hand that wrote it. I'd seen Sarah's plant drawings, and the handwriting matched. The letter thanked me for the scripture readings that summer, said she'd found the passages particularly illuminating. That was all, but it was enough. The existence of this letter was significant. If Sarah had survived to write it, she'd not only reached safety, but had maintained her literacy. A dangerous thing for any black person in the South, enslaved or free, and evidence of remarkable determination. She'd also maintained connections, knew who could be trusted to carry messages across state lines without asking too many questions. Reverend Blackwell pressed for more details about Sarah's destination, her life after escape. Phyllis shook her head. That knowledge died with the people who had it. Safer that way. The less any one person knows, the less they can reveal under pressure. She paused, but I heard stories over the years, rumors from travelers. Talk of a black medicine woman in the backcountry who treated everyone equally. Cherokee, Creek, white settlers, escaped slaves, free black families. Some said she'd married a Cherokee trader. Others claimed she lived alone, independent, beholden to no one. The stories contradicted each other, which probably means at least some were true. Before they parted, Phyllis asked Blackwell what he intended to do with Jenkins's confession. The Reverend was honest. He didn't know. Phyllis offered advice. The war will end eventually. When it does, we'll build something new, or try to. That new country will need to decide what kind of justice it wants. The old kind, where law protects power and property above all else? Or something better? Your journal, Reverend, with Jenkins's confession and this conversation, keep it. Someday, someone will need to know that even in dark times, some people chose mercy over law. That will matter more than you think. Reverend Blackwell took her advice. His journal remained in his family's possession, a private document recording the moral complexities that official histories preferred to ignore. But the ripples of Sarah's case extended beyond Georgetown. In the years following her escape, South Carolina saw a notable decline in witchcraft accusations. This wasn't due to growing rationality alone, though the Enlightenment was influencing colonial thought, but because Sarah's disappearance had demonstrated the practical problems with such prosecutions. If accused witches could escape through supernatural means, what was the point of trials? And if they escaped through human aid, as some suspected, then the social consensus needed for executions was clearly lacking. Dr. Hayes's pamphlet about Sarah's case, published in 1749, had actually worked against its author's intentions. Rather than establishing Hayes as an expert on supernatural matters, it made him look credulous and superstitious. Educated readers in Charleston and Savannah, influenced by European scientific thinking, mocked his conclusions. One satirical response, published in the South Carolina Gazette in 1750, suggested that perhaps Dr. Hayes's medical treatments were the real witchcraft, given how many patients survived by avoiding his care. Hayes's medical practice declined steadily after this controversy. By 1755, he'd lost most of his wealthy patients. The lawsuit that ended his career in 1763 was almost merciful. It gave him an excuse to retire, rather than admit he'd been abandoned by the very society he'd tried to defend against supposed supernatural threats. Meanwhile, at Fairmont Plantation, the consequences of Sarah's trial and escape continued to manifest in ways that couldn't be easily explained. The section of rice fields that had been sabotaged never recovered full productivity, but that was understandable given the salt contamination. What was less easily explained was the pattern of misfortune that seemed to follow Jonathan Fairmont specifically. His slaves didn't run away more than others. Escape from low-country rice plantations was notoriously difficult given the geography and patrols, but they worked with a kind of deliberate inefficiency that was impossible to punish because it left no clear evidence. Tools weren't missing, they just broke more often. Repairs were completed, they just needed to be redone more frequently. Work was finished. It just took longer than before. McLeish, the overseer, noted this in his reports but couldn't identify specific culprits. The enslaved community at Fairmont had closed ranks in a way that transcended individual personality. They weren't rebellious. That would bring violent punishment. They were simply less enthusiastic, less invested in the plantation's success. And in an economy that depended on enslaved people caring enough about their work to do it well, this quiet disengagement was devastating. Jonathan tried increasing punishments, then tried reducing them. He tried offering incentives, then tried rotating work assignments. Nothing changed the fundamental dynamic. His slaves would work exactly as hard as necessary to avoid punishment, and not a fraction more. Catherine, for her part, never recovered from Benjamin's death. She'd initially blamed Sarah. That was easier than blaming her husband for choosing Dr. Hayes over effective treatment. But as months became years, she couldn't maintain the delusion. Benjamin had been dying under Hayes's care, improving under Sarah's. Her son's death was the price of social convention, of deference to credentialed authority over practical results. She began having dreams, not supernatural visions, just the ordinary nightmares of grief and guilt. In these dreams, Benjamin lived because she'd had the courage to defy Jonathan and Dr. Hayes, to insist that Sarah continue treatment regardless of social consequences. She'd wake crying, knowing that maternal instinct had been right and social propriety had been fatal. In 1754, Catherine convinced Jonathan to free 3 of their slaves, an elderly couple and a skilled carpenter, an unprecedented act of manumission for the Fairmonts. Jonathan agreed, partly to please his increasingly fragile wife, partly because the slaves in question were past prime working age, and partly because some desperate part of him hoped that demonstrating mercy might lift the atmosphere of quiet condemnation that had settled over his property. It didn't help. The remaining enslaved people at Fairmont acknowledged the manumissions with the same careful neutrality they applied to everything. They weren't impressed by mercy that came 8 years late and benefited people already too old for hard labor. The final piece of Sarah's story emerged from multiple sources over many decades, each adding fragments to a picture that would never be complete but could at least approach truth. The first substantial information came from the Cherokee oral history that Tzali shared with the missionary in 1802. But there was more to Tzali's account than the missionary recorded in his official report. In private conversation, Tzali provided details he considered too sensitive for public record. Rachel, as Sarah had renamed herself, arrived in Cherokee territory in the late summer of 1748, carried by a network of guides who moved her from safe house to safe house along routes used for trading and communication. She was exhausted, traumatized, and determined never to be property again. The Cherokee had complex relationships with escaped slaves. Some tribes returned runaways for reward money. Others offered shelter, recognizing kindred spirits in people fleeing white authority. The decision usually depended on individual circumstances and the usefulness of the person seeking refuge. Rachel proved extraordinarily useful. Within weeks of arrival, she treated a respected elder's chronic joint pain with techniques that Cherokee healers acknowledged worked better than their traditional approaches. She learned Cherokee medical practices in exchange for teaching her own knowledge, a genuine trade between equals that she'd never experienced in colonial society. She wept the first time someone asked her opinion rather than ordered her action. Tzali told the missionary, "We didn't understand why until she explained what her life had been before. Then we understood that what we considered normal human respect was something she'd been denied for most of her existence." Rachel lived among the Cherokee for about 5 years, from 1748 to approximately 1753. During this time, she married, not a Cherokee man as some rumors suggested, but another refugee, a mixed-race trader named William Crawford who'd been fleeing debt charges and discrimination from white settlements. Their marriage was never legally recognized by colonial authorities, but within the Cherokee community and the loose network of backcountry settlers who didn't ask too many questions, they were simply William and Rachel, a married couple who kept to themselves and helped their neighbors. They had no children. Whether by choice, circumstance, or biological inability, the records don't say. But Rachel helped deliver dozens of children in the backcountry, both Cherokee and settler. Her reputation spread across territories that had no newspapers or official communication networks, spread by the oldest form of advertising, grateful parents telling their friends about the woman who'd saved their babies. In 1753, William died in a hunting accident, a genuine accident, nothing suspicious, just the everyday dangers of backcountry life. Rachel buried him on a hillside he'd loved, beneath an oak tree they'd planted together the year they married. She chose to stay in the area rather than return to Cherokee territory, building a small cabin on unclaimed land that nobody bothered to dispute because it was too far from anything valuable. For the next 11 years, until her death in 1764, Rachel operated as an independent medical practitioner in a region where independence was possible precisely because official authority rarely reached. She treated Cherokee families, white settlers, escaped slaves seeking refuge, free black families establishing farms, mixed-race communities existing in legal gray areas, anyone who needed help and showed respect. She maintained her literacy, carefully recording treatments and observations in the notebook that would later surface in 1856. The notebook reveals a mind that never stopped learning, never stopped refining techniques, never stopped questioning why remedies worked or didn't. She experimented with different preparation methods for the same plants, documented seasonal variations in effectiveness, noted which treatments worked better for children than adults, recorded the warning signs that suggested when conventional remedies wouldn't be enough. The notebook also contained personal observations that revealed Rachel's psychological state. One entry from 1758, treated white settler family today. Father called me ma'am and paid in smoked venison. Such simple respect still surprises me. I have been free for 10 years. Yet I still expect orders and blows. I wonder if this expectation ever fully disappears, or if trauma carves permanent channels in the mind that freedom cannot entirely erase. Another entry, undated but presumably from the early 1760s, reflected today on the 33 lives I saved before they called me witch. I have saved at least 200 more since then, probably more that I've lost count of. The difference is that now people thank me instead of fearing me. The medicine hasn't changed. My knowledge hasn't changed. Only my legal status and the color of my patient's desperation has changed. This tells me everything I need to know about which was real, the crime they accused me of, or the crime they committed against me. Sally's account of Rachel's death was both tragic and fitting. In February 1764, one of the worst winters in Carolina memory, a woman in a settlement 2 days' walk from Rachel's cabin went into premature labor. The husband arrived at Rachel's door during a blizzard, begging for help. Rachel, now approximately 60 years old, gathered her supplies and went. The journey took 8 hours through snow that reached their knees. By the time they arrived, the woman was in crisis. Rachel worked through the night, managing a complicated delivery that should have killed both mother and child. Through skill, experience, and determination that transcended physical exhaustion, she delivered a healthy baby girl just before dawn. The mother survived. The baby survived. Rachel, who'd walked through a blizzard at age 60 and worked through the night in a freezing cabin, developed pneumonia. She died 4 days later, her last words reportedly, "The baby lives, that's what matters." The Cherokee community and the scattered backcountry settlers who'd known her pooled resources to give her a proper burial. They laid her to rest on the hillside she'd chosen, next to William, beneath the oak tree. Over 100 people attended. Cherokee, white settlers, free black families, and several people who'd clearly been enslaved but were visiting relatives for the weekend, a transparent fiction that everyone politely accepted. One of these visitors was a young man named Isaac, who'd traveled from a plantation near Charleston. In a letter he later wrote to his brother, a letter that was preserved in a collection of African-American correspondence and rediscovered in 1934. Isaac described attending Rachel's funeral and hearing stories about her life. "They say she was born enslaved," Isaac wrote. "They say she was nearly burned for healing people. They say she escaped and lived free for 16 years, healing hundreds more. I do not know if all these stories are true, but I stood by her grave and saw people of 3